Probably wait just another minute or two to let people roll in. All right, well, I think I will start the introductory portion. So welcome everyone to AIA Virginia's Resiliency Week 2023. In our run up to Earth Day, we wanted to tackle the idea of resiliency and what that means. So we see resiliency as a proactive approach to the changes in our world, whether they be environmental, social, or economic. Our solutions need to be holistic while bringing together the related stakeholders. So on Monday, we talked about shoreline restoration in the Elizabeth River Project. Today, we will talk about decarbonization and the built environment. And on Friday, we will discuss master planning for resiliency. So thank you for joining today, and please consider joining Friday as well. So now I get the honor of introducing our speaker. Michael Lennox is the Taylor Murphy Professor and Senior Associate Dean and Chief Strategy Officer for UVA's Darden School of Business. He received his PhD in Technology Management and Policy from MIT in 1999 and the degrees of Bachelor and Master of Science in Systems Engineering from the University of Virginia. Since then, he has taught at multiple prestigious business schools and was even the founder of Duke's Corporate Sustainability Initiative. His research has been in over 30 refereed academic publications, which has led to numerous media citations. Professor Lennox explores the interface between business strategy and public policy as it relates to the natural environment. You can read more about his work in his recent books, Can Business Save the Earth? And the Decarbonization Imperatives. Thank you, Mike, for joining today, and take it away.
Well, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you all here. Our agenda today is very simple. I'm going to take a few minutes of our time here to give a kind of a brief lecture, and then I want to make sure to reserve some time to answer your questions. If things come up as I'm talking, please feel free to put them into the chat, and I'll try to address them either as I go through the presentation or when we open it up to Q&A. Just to hit on some of the themes that Chris discussed there, my background is as an economist, studied economics at MIT, but I've long had this interest around technology and innovation, and particularly what we might call disruptive change. When new technologies, new markets emerge as new technologies and sciences advance. And that's been very influential on my own thinking about our climate change challenge, in particular decarbonization. So to begin the talk, to kind of hit that point home, I actually want to talk about whales. Why whales? Well, I actually have a particular part of whales that I want to talk about, which is whaling, and in particular, the New England whaling industry. The New England whaling industry, as you can imagine, was a vibrant industry, created a lot of jobs and opportunity in the 19th century. It achieved probably the height of its prominence in the 1850s. And interestingly, in a fairly short order of time, in less than a decade, largely disappeared from the shores of the United States. So what happened to the whaling industry? Was it that they basically harvested all the whales out there in the ocean? Fortunately, no, that wasn't the case. While whaling pushed them further and further around the world, that really wasn't what was causing this shift away from this industry. And what in particular had happened was the discovery of oil in Western Pennsylvania And this gentleman here, Abraham Gesner, a Canadian, discovered a way to take that oil and refine it into kerosene. Whale oil had been used as primarily as a way for lighting in city streets and in homes. And in very quick order, kerosene became the preferred choice for lighting fluids, and it basically caused a disruption which ended the whaling market and started the kerosene market. It's interesting to note, as you probably well know, that industry got disrupted about 30, 40 years after this period with the discovery of the incandescent light bulb by Thomas Edison and the push for electrification in our cities. And I highlight these stories because this process of renewal and innovation is really endemic to our capitalist society in our market-based economies here. The Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter referred to these as the gales of creative destruction. So a lot of my work and what I'm going to talk about today is trying to understand these gales of creative destruction and understand when do we get the transformations in industries, in sectors and technology, with a particular lens, of course, on the emergence of clean technologies and decarbonization. So as Chris mentioned, I have 2 books out on the topic, Can Business Save the Earth? Trying to be provocative with the title here. That was with my co-author, Ronnie Chatterjee. To brag a little bit about Ronnie, Ronnie is actually the chief economist right now for the Department of Commerce and is leading efforts around the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act for implementing industrial policy as it relates to some of our decarbonization efforts. My more recent book with my colleague, Becky Duff, looks at climate change very specifically, and in particular, this decarbonization challenge that we face. And again, let me just kind of briefly summarize the arguments in these, and then I'm going to share some data with you on where we stand. So our basic argument in the first book, Can Business Save the Earth?, was that when you think about the scope of the environmental problems we face, climate change, of course, but also issues around water, the nitrogen cycle, the host of issues we face in our global community, what we ultimately need in our argument is sustainable disruptive innovation on a massive scale. Sustainable in the environmental sense, technologies that are better for the world than the ones we currently have, and disruptive in the economic sense that I was alluding to before. Disruptive in that they're replacing whole old industries and technologies being replaced with new. So think about renewable energy replacing our fossil fuel burning natural gas generators and coal-fired power plants and the like. Now, when we start talking about innovation, it's important to recognize that innovation happens in a market context. And so a lot of what I do is thinking about commercial viability. When are these technologies ready for prime time, ready to be adopted and scaled within the marketplace? As a result, businesses and markets are critical players in the way I think about innovation and what is happening in the commercial markets. In particular, entrepreneurs hold a particularly important part in these stories. They are often the lead disruptors in new technologies. And one of the things that often happens when we have these changes in disruption is that we also see a change in the competitive regime. And so it's often incumbent firms that are going out of business as new firms come along. And you can think about things like what's happening in the auto industry and the rise of a company like Tesla and the challenges facing incumbent firms like Ford and General Motors. Last but not least, an important element of my work is thinking about how innovation emerges out of this broader institutional envelope. So what do I mean by that? So what you see here is a really simple stylized framework for thinking about innovation. At the core is a traditional innovation process where you have your innovators, they're pushing technology along. You have your market players, investors and managers, they're developing, commercializing, diffusing that technology. And then of course you have your customers who are creating the demand for that technology and pulling it through that process. But they don't operate in isolation. They're actually surrounded by a broad set of intermediaries and interveners. So we talk about public interveners. These are regulators, government policy, national labs. They all influence how this innovation process plays out. You also have private players, activists, universities, business, trade associations that are all influencing the way innovation takes place and ultimately adoption occurs. So in my more recent book on the decarbonization imperative, we asked 2 very specific questions related to climate change. First, what is the likelihood of us achieving decarbonization by the year 2050? And then second, what levers may we pull to best increase the likelihood of achieving this? And I use the term levers very specifically because I want to talk about public policy, federal policy, local policies, and the like, but also more broadly, private interventions, public-private partnerships, the broader set of levers that could be influential in us meeting our decarbonized future here. So central to a lot of my work is this idea of the industry life cycle. This is a very common pattern. This is a stylized representation of it here in the chart of what happens when new technologies come along. And critical to our understanding of the industry life cycle are what we call S-curves. So if you think about a technology and its advancement over time, in the early stages of the technology, there could be a lot of investment and efforts, but not much progress being made on that technology. But if it's going to be disrupted, you typically hit a sweet spot where you see significant improvement in that technology that then is followed by significant adoption of that technology in the marketplace. That can be represented by the cumulative revenues line here. And then eventually there's a period where you might get decreasing returns to your efforts. The technology advances to a point that every effort to improve it a little more only gives you marginal gains. You think about something like the internal combustion engine and how in that early period, there was lots of improvements made, but now to get a little more efficiency out of your internal combustion engine takes a lot of effort. If you think about renewables, you will see a similar pattern where solar technology, for example, had been invested in for decades before we really hit that sweet spot in the S-curve over the last decade plus. And I'll share with you some specific data on that industry of where I think we are in the S-curve. The second thing I would highlight from this graph is the firm, hard, strong line there. And what we often see in industries is what we call a shakeout. That as a new technology emerges, we see massive entry. We see entry from new entrepreneurial companies moving into the new emerging market. We see incumbent firms diversifying into the new market. And often a competitive shakeout results where companies are overflowing the market. Some go out of business, some merge and acquire with one another. And then it usually settles down into a smaller number of players. Technologies, you think about smartphones. Before Apple really became the dominant market, there were hundreds of players, Windows phones and the like, that were playing in that space that ultimately, as the shakeout occurred, lead us to the world we live in now, where you have Android and Apple, and really Samsung and Apple as being dominant players in that market space. This is important because as we think about decarbonization and our clean tech adoption, we're going to use these stylized patterns to try to read the tea leaves to make some predictions about kind of where we are in different industry sectors. And in a minute here, we're going to relate it right back to the built environment and some of the things that we might be seeing there. All right, so let's take a deep dive on climate change. I imagine this is familiar to many of you here. Here we see a melting glacier. I believe this is out of Greenland. Obviously, sea level rise is one of the concerns with climate change, increases in extreme weather. When I think about the impacts of climate change, I worry probably more about kind of the social, political, and economic consequences of these behaviors and of these changes. I worry about sea level rise causing a mass migration and environmental refugees from a place like Bangladesh flooding into a country like India and destabilizing it there. So the simple science here, I'm not an environmental scientist, but following what the scientists tell us is that we have seen this massive increase in CO2 concentration, basically starting in the industrialization period, and it continues to grow. And in terms of what we're trying to achieve here, if we don't do anything and those greenhouse gas emissions continue, we could see anywhere from 4 to 5 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature. I think our climate scientists would tell us that would be catastrophic to so many ecosystems across Earth. And the real target that the Paris Accord set was to try to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, preferably, or at the very least 2 degrees Celsius. So to achieve those lower pathways, as you can see, you're going to have to significantly reduce global greenhouse gas emissions right away. The next few years are really, really critical. 2050 has been a date that many people have latched onto as when we need to get to net zero carbon emissions. If we continue on the pace we're on, that number gets actually shorter and shorter, 2040, 2035. if we are actually going to achieve the Paris Accord goals there. So let's break down the problem a little further. To me, this is the most interesting, important graph that I'm going to share with you. This comes directly from the IPCC. If we look at scope 1 emissions, where the emissions actually occur across various industry sectors, this is what we see on a global basis. Transportation is an important one, not surprisingly, in vehicles, but also airplanes and shipping. Globally, it's only about 14%. It's actually one of the larger percentages in the United States in terms of our footprint. Not surprisingly, electricity and electrical generation is about a quarter of all global emissions, a significant one. We're going to talk more about that. But there's a couple other sectors that I think are really important here that we don't want to lose sight of. About a fifth of all global emissions comes from what we call broadly the industrial sector, but in particular, cement and steel are significant greenhouse gas emitters. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a second here. Agriculture is another one that is sometimes surprising to people to realize that it's about a quarter of all global emissions. I'm not going to spend much time talking about agriculture today. All I will say is that this is a particularly difficult one to address, to decarbonize. If you think about the growth in human population that is projected, we're going to need to increase food production by about 30%, probably by the end of this century. And that's going to require us to produce more food, hopefully on less land with less environmental impact. So it's a very tall order. Last but not least, you see the 6% at the bottom for the built environment or for buildings. Now, to be very clear, this is just scope 1 emissions. And in particular, especially in like the United States, this is primarily the burning of fossil fuels, in particular natural gas for heating homes, and also the use in cooking of natural gas and other fossil fuels here. If we think about the broader impact of buildings, as I'm sure most of you know, that also includes scope 2 emissions, so electrical generation. Again, we'll talk more about how those two connect. And also scope 3 emissions through the supply chain. And that would include things like the use of cement and steel again. So that 6% is just those scope 1 emissions. If we think about the broader scope 2 and scope 3 impacts of buildings, it's obviously a much larger percentage of our greenhouse gas impact. So the good news is there is an emerging vision of what a decarbonized economy and decarbonized global society looks like. And it largely centers around electrification. As much as possible, shift away from fossil fuels and use electrification as a way to get ourselves off of those fossil fuels. An obvious example would be the electrification of vehicles, stop using gasoline, start using electricity there. Once again, in the home, I'll talk more about this, but electrifying things like use of heat pumps, using electric stoves, and again, reducing that to hopefully zero, the use of fossil fuels. For the industrial sector, there's many of them that could be potentially electrified, including in the steel industry, the use of something called an electric arc furnace in a mini mill that could be theoretically decarbonized. This all puts a lot of pressure at the center of this diagram, which is our electrical generation of sources here. Clearly, there is a big push towards renewables. And as I will discuss, there are some challenges there to move to 100% renewables. But there is some real promise here as well, and this relates directly to the built environment, that as we start to connect more and more of these electrical sources and uses to a broader system, we could actually start to create some efficiencies in our electrical generation system, but also in terms of our decarbonization challenge. And again, I'm going to return to this in a few minutes here. So let me go through some of these sectors and just share with you some data and tell you kind of where I think we are in these transformations and disruptions. So transportation is the one that I am most excited about in terms of that I think we are really turning the corner. And I think there's reasons to be very optimistic about our ability to decarbonize, especially automobile transport. So here we see data on the cost of producing a battery pack for a vehicle. You can see this pack and cell cost is decreasing quite substantially over the last 10 years or so. If you think about what an electric vehicle is, it's actually a fairly simple machine. It doesn't have all the systems that an internal combustion engine would have. It doesn't have a fuel injector. It doesn't have a gas tank. It doesn't have the exhaust system. Really, at the end of the day, all it is a battery stack and a few electric motors. And so as a result, electric vehicles tend to have a lot less moving parts. They're a lot less cheaper to manufacture, with the exception of the battery pack. That tends to be the dominant cost associated with them. So as we drive down this cost curve, there is real hope that we are getting very close to the point that electric vehicles will not only be superior from an environmental sense, they have some superior attributes in terms of performance, but they actually might be the lower cost option compared to internal combustion engines. Now, to some people, that might be surprising to hear. You hear all the rhetoric about, oh, electric vehicles are so expensive. Some of that are strategic choices of company. Tesla has strategically positioned themselves as an elite car manufacturer, and the better comparables for them are things like a BMW 3 Series or a Volvo and the like. And in fact, in that comparable, a Tesla is actually price competitive even now with those alternatives. So I think we're in a path here of seeing this decreasing cost of battery cells. And again, we might be 2-3 years away from where electric vehicles will actually be the cheapest cars available on the marketplace. And you can see this reflected in the adoption data here. So the blue is plug-in hybrids, the green are pure electrics, and then the red is the EV market share. And you can see what we would hope to see, this exponential growth in the adoption of electric vehicles. Was hoping for a doubling again from the 2 to 4 to 8 to hopefully 16. We saw 13% here. These things never go exactly as theorized. But I think the important point here is if these trends continue, even over the next few years, you will likely see the vast majority of new vehicle sales of cars being electric by the end of this decade. And this is assuming no further interventions than what are already occurring in the marketplace here. So I think this is very exciting. And I think there's a lot of people who are actually underestimating how these types of changes take place. Again, history has proven that when technologies reach those tipping points, adoption can actually occur very quickly. Again, think about the diffusion of the iPhone or the diffusion of flat screen TVs. All of these types of products have diffused actually much quicker than maybe a lot of people had expected. So what does this mean for the built environment? What does it mean as an architect, perhaps designing commercial buildings, residential buildings, and the like? Well, once again, I think electrification of vehicles is happening much quicker than many people realize. I think we're going to be looking for increased demand for charging infrastructure. On one side, as an economist, I'm excited to see that the marketplace is actually taking this challenge up already. And so you're seeing more and more kind of available charging infrastructure out there. There are clearly certain challenges, especially in city environments and the like, that will need to have some publicly funded infrastructure. But on the private market side, I think you're already seeing incredible pressure on apartments and parking garages and commercial buildings and commercial offices to have charging infrastructure in place. And as you get more and more people acquiring these electric vehicles, we're going to see that demand. Now, as a result, as we think about our commercial buildings and residential buildings and the like, they're also going to see a significant increase in demand for electricity. The numbers roughly that I understand is that if we could wave a magic wand and electrify all automobiles in the United States today, we would see a 50% increase in demand for electricity across the board. So we're talking about a very significant increase in demand for electricity that is going to be placed on commercial real estate, residential buildings, and the like, in what I think is going to be the very near future. And in terms of amenities for renters and the like, this is going to be almost a requirement, I think, for a lot of buildings here. The other interesting thing, and I'll talk more about this when we talk about the grid, is that the use of EVs actually puts a battery in everyone's home or in their office and the like. And the batteries themselves, traditionally right now, are used simply, you charge the battery, you drive the vehicle. But there is real hope that we could actually run it the other way, that when the car is just simply sitting there, maybe we actually take electricity from that battery in the car to power our homes or our offices and the like. And that creates some opportunities to do load sharing and balancing in a way to create real efficiencies within offices, within residential buildings, and really with our broader electrical grid here. So again, I think the electrification of vehicles has some real implications here for the built environment. All right, so let's talk about the big one here, electrical generation. I'm pleased to say, and I imagine many of you are aware, this has been a really transformational period over the last decade of what's been happening with electricity. Let me put some data to that. So first, starting again with the cost curve here, we have seen a significant decrease in costs in residential and commercial and utility scale photovoltaics. Similar types of reductions as well with wind, but I think for our purposes today, it's better to just focus on solar, which you're going to see more likely uptake in commercial and residential area. So this has been, again, a fabulous, cost curve. Every reason to believe that this will continue moving forward as we scale up more and more production of solar panels and installation. And that's going to make this more and more cost effective in more and more situations here. And in fact, we are seeing this translate directly into adoption. Again, utility grade solar is the big jump here. You can see in the blue, but we're also seeing significant growth in residential and commercial solar installations as well as the idea of community solar kind of shared with a mini grid type structure here. So these trends are very positive, and again, one would imagine they will continue to see this kind of exponential growth in installations. Now, unlike vehicles, there are some areas of concern that we need to be aware of and cognizant of. But before I get to that, actually, I forgot about this slide. We also are noticing on the electrical grid side, on the utility side, that basically the era of fossil fuels is quickly declining here. And so what this chart shows is new additional electrical capacity generation. So back in 2010, you still saw that solar and wind were less than 30%. We still had quite a significant amount of coal-fired power plants being built. And what we've seen over the last decade plus is first, coal has basically disappeared as a new generation source, and increasingly old sources of coal generation are being retired and even retired earlier than planned because of the cost dynamics. Part of that cost dynamics has been driven by the price of natural gas. So you do see significant new additions of natural gas generators. But that number has also been shrinking and being taken up by renewables, solar and wind now making upwards of 90%, if not more, of the new generation capacity put into the grid in the United States. And that is likely to continue again because of those cost dynamics. It's just simply becoming the lowest cost source of electricity generation, and the utilities know this and they're adopting it in kind. However, we've got a long way to go. And this is the global electrical production here. And what you see is that top little green piece there, that there has been this significant increase in the use of renewables and solar and wind. Hydropower arguably is the original renewable. It still continues to grow, but not necessarily maybe where a lot of people are placing their bets. And yet gas and coal are still growing in terms of their total usage in the global electrical production, especially in places like China and India. China is a leader in the use of renewables, but they're also still producing coal-fired power plants. And obviously these trends have to reverse if we're going to address our climate change challenge. The other thing we need to be aware of, and it's very important, is the intermittency issue. Renewables, the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. These vary both on a daily basis. So each graph here shows what a daily demand profile might look like from the grid. But they also vary over the course of the year. So the warmer months where more AC is being used, that is going to put more demand on our grid and have some implications. Now, the good news, of course, is solar generation is stronger during the summer, probably not enough to fully offset the increase in demand that we see. So this intermittency issue creates both some challenges, but also some really interesting opportunities. And so if we go back to this vision for a fully electrified economy, what we start to see is a very distributed system where we will hopefully have solar panels on commercial buildings, on residential buildings. We've got electric vehicles in the parking lot or in the garage. And all of these tied together in a dynamic grid probably need to be connected in what we call smart grid technology, backed up by batteries and allowing us to vary loads over time, depending on, again, whether the sun is shining and what the demand function is. It could actually pretend to actually lower what we call peak load times, when there's a lot of people using electricity, maybe when they first get home from work and the like. And that actually has some economic benefits as well. So maybe it will be, again, that you charge your car in the evening when there's less demand, then you use your battery in your car to help, power your house in the evening when you get home. And all of this levels out the grid in a way that creates economic benefits and efficiencies across the board. So what are the implications for the built environment? Again, addressing this intermittency issue requires a system level approach, and the built environment needs to be an important part of that solution. Distributed renewables, storage, and EVs, absolutely critical to making this system work. This is going to require significant investment of electrical lines and smart grid technology, not only, by the way, to make the balancing of loads matter, but also the pricing of electricity. People will become not only consumers of electricity, buildings will be consumers of electricity, but they'll be producers as well. So at various points, they might be selling back to the grid and the like. Some other thoughts here in terms of especially utility scale renewables like solar, but even in, maybe even especially in like residential and commercial, there are people who are resistant to even solar panels, even though, in my opinion, they're pretty innocuous here, but from aesthetic reasons. And I think the idea of turning to the aesthetic is going to be important as we try to build out more and more, and need to build out more and more of these installations of renewables here. I've been surprised to hear from some of the companies I work with who are doing solar installations that they're getting resistance from communities who say, like, we really love our field, we don't want it to be replaced by solar panels there. So this beautification and this need to kind of really motivate adoption, I think, is going to be really important moving forward. And then again, as I mentioned before, this really changes the whole nature of the relationship with the electrical grid and your utility provider. No longer are you just merely a consumer of electricity, but you're in essence, a two-sided market where you're both buying and selling electricity. Change your relationship with utility, change your relationship maybe even with local other organizations, other buildings, other companies in your environment, where you can start to be a trading partner with them as it relates to electricity. All right, let's talk a little bit about industrials. As I mentioned, industrials are about 1/5 of all global emissions, but really the big two, the two that we should be paying attention most to, are steel and cement. As probably most of you are aware, steel and cement are kind of the backbone of our industrial economy or industrial society. In the built environment, they are heavily used and in many cases hard to substitute away from in certain applications and the like. So here you see global steel production. We continue to use more and more steel. It continues to grow in terms of the demand side. But equally importantly is to look at the types of ways we generate steel. As I mentioned before, electric arc furnaces use what we call mini mill technology. There are ways in which we could use renewables to power the electric arc furnaces and produce electricity produce steel that is actually net zero. It relies on the use of scrap metal instead of using iron ore and producing steel natively. However, still the vast majority of our production is the basic oxygen furnace. If I showed you this, by the way, by nation, China is by far and away the biggest producer of steel in the world, and they predominantly use the basic oxygen furnace. So steel is going to be a really tough industry sector to try to decarbonize here. Cement demand here is relatively stable. You can see different countries. Again, China is the largest producer of cement by far. This is a technology and industry where you create greenhouse gas emissions in the actual creation of the cement itself. Here, there are some really interesting technologies coming down the pipeline, what we call green cement, that not only could eliminate the emissions associated with cement, but it could actually be a net negative source here where it actually absorbs carbon as it's curating and hardening there. The problem, of course, is whether those net zero technologies are going to be, or net negative technologies are going to be economically viable in the near future. And there's a lot of groups working on that, fingers crossed, but this is a huge important issue. And again, the use of steel and cement in our in our built environment is really critical. So again, just hit this point again, steel and cement are the backbones of our built environment. There are substitutes, things like structural timber has been advancing greatly. My understanding is I think we're up to about 40-story buildings could be built with structural timber. But again, if you're going to build anything larger, a big skyscraper, you might not be able to use that solution. But again, advances are happening here. And again, with innovative alternatives like green cement, they're promising that they need to get further down that cost curve pipeline to find large adoption within the construction community. All right, last but not least, let's talk about the one most directly and important to you all, the built environment here. Here's a picture of Amazon's planned HQ2, their second headquarters central building here up in Northern Virginia, nearby where I am. Perhaps not surprising to you all, about 50-50 when it comes to consumption in US homes between electricity and uses of fossil fuel, predominantly natural gas. This also holds for commercial buildings here, roughly the same kind of 50-50 breakdown here between the use of fossil fuels and the use of electricity here. You can also see how it's broken down. Again, the vast majority for space and heating, water heating and cooking making up the majority of the remainder uses of fossil fuels here. Now, the good news here is there are commercially viable alternatives already available on the marketplace and seeing greater and greater adoption and greater efficiencies and lower costs. Electric heat pumps, the use of electric resistant water heaters, these are coming and on the market. And again, vary in whether they are the most economical choice or not. A lot of this obviously depends on geography. There was a nice chart that was in the Wall Street Journal recently, where they mapped out kind of what's happening in different parts of the country. And you can see, for example, the South is actually primarily does use electricity for heating. That's a good thing. You have, interestingly, in the Northeast, the use of oil still, even though that's less efficient and less cost efficient. And then the use of natural gas and propane through the middle of the country in particular here. So what are we seeing for the built environment? Well, again, viable alternatives are here. They exist, but can sometimes be too expensive, depending on the location, depending on the climate in those different regions. In the US, this decarbonization effort, again, is going to be about electrifying those gas-powered sources. And this is really going to be, in many cases, about renovating and retrofitting a very substantial, already built environment and trying to get them to adopt electrical alternatives. And so one of the big challenges in my mind with the built environment is how long are those capital stocks and when do you actually invest to replace them? And can we somehow accelerate that replacement effect of these old systems that are there? As many of you probably are very well aware, buildings also hold real potential for even being net negative sources of carbon emissions by using things like green roofs and other approaches. So there's so much innovation that architects in the built industry have been pushing for years that we're seeing adoption. My question as an economist is like, how can we make this happen quicker and efficiently throughout the economy and our built environment? So I'm borrowing this from the World Green Building Council, but this idea, again, when you think about a building and what a zero carbon building is, at one level it's energy efficiency, but it can also be more directly, removing the use of fossil fuels. It can be about helping with this peak demand issue with electrical demand, especially with the incorporation of renewable energy into the building itself. And then last but not least, the whole idea of embedded carbon here. Can we use structural timber and other substitutes for the more greenhouse gas emitting intensive materials like cement and steel in a way to actually create a net negative building. So I think, again, lots of exciting work happening on our built environment of how we can decarbonize it. In my decarbonization imperative book, our viewpoint is there is no silver bullet to these challenges we face. From a policy and a lever perspective, we need a broad-based, broad portfolio of interventions. Dare I call it a technology policy. As somebody who's been studying industrial and technology policy for 30 years, in many ways, we felt like we were out in the darkness there for many, many years. But now it's become all the rage in the last 2 or 3 years. So it's actually kind of very exciting to see our policymakers thinking more strategically about how do we advance certain technologies and get them widely adopted in the marketplace. And in terms of the built environment, just highlight a few here. Obviously, creating incentives for electrification. This could be everything from changing local building codes to signing up for voluntary programs like LEED, to leveraging what we call green banks for green debt financing to help finance some of these efforts to electrify and remove greenhouse gas burning furnaces and the like from our portfolio. We don't want to undersell behavioral changes and how we get people to reduce their power usage. And there's a whole rich bunch of work being done to think about how to get consumers to use less electricity. And then finally, the idea of carbon sinks here, really kind of interesting. Cement being one that I think is particularly interesting. The use of embedded carbon, again, in structural timber and the like. And there's a lot of interesting investment happening in this space as well. So it's one to keep your eye on and one that could be a significant game changer in the built environment. Last but not least, I just was going to make a brief call to the Inflation Reduction Act. If you haven't looked at the details of this, it's a very broad bill that has lots of different incentives for lots of different pieces of the puzzle that I was talking about today. There are any number of subsidies and the like that try to incentivize things like rooftop solar, the use of geothermal heating, energy efficient appliances and the like. The electrification of vehicles, again, can be used in complement with changes in the built environment, especially at homes and offices. And so again, it's beyond me to kind of go into each of these in great detail. I would just point out that it is worth taking a deep dive into the Inflation Reduction Act because it is helping incentivize a lot of these transitions that we've talked about. And again, especially in the built environment where it's sometimes very hard to get a business or a consumer or an individual residential home owner to make these types of transitions. So just some final concluding thoughts, and then I'd like to open it up for questions. Again, if we're going to take climate change seriously, we need to take a concerted effort to cause this disruptive change across a number of large sectors here. We need to be thinking about both public policy, but also private interventions to accelerate these current technology trends. The policy leaders need to be thinking broadly about their levers. Again, I'm glad to see that there has been more concerted effort to think broadly about all those levers that can be pulled. And from a business standpoint, there are both worries, but also opportunities here. Any number of entrepreneurial ventures and the like that are moving in to try to solve various pieces of this puzzle, including, again, in the built environment. And they're going to be really critical players in moving and driving these new technologies and ultimately causing this replacement of the use of fossil fuels. So with that, let me open it up to any questions, comments, concerns about what I've shared with you today.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Michael. Yeah, I guess I would start, so to kind of break the ice on the questions. So as far as a public policy that could be implemented in order to encourage the electrification of the built environment, what are some of the specific ideas that you have to speed that along?
So again, this is where policy has so many different tentacles, right? And it would take a lot of work, but local zoning laws, right? Local zoning laws and building codes can go a long way to try to encourage, especially on obviously any new infrastructure being built, to discourage the use of fossil fuels. We're already seeing that in California and some states that are moving in that direction. In terms of retrofits, I think this is where financial incentives come in. So again, things like the Inflation Reduction Act, creating financial incentives for businesses and homeowners to retrofit and remove fossil fuel burning sources of technology.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right, well then I got another one. All right, so I was reading an article today, and this week there was the World Copper Conference in Santiago, Chile, and a big topic of debate was that there will not be enough copper produced in order to create the green transition.
Yeah.
What are some of the challenges and solutions with the lack of natural resources needed for this to happen?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question because I think you see this a lot. There's copper, there's lithium, rare earth metals. All of these are important inputs to things like solar panels and batteries in particular. My thinking is we should not underestimate the challenges of building out those transitions. However, this is where markets can actually be a real strong conduit for change. And so take lithium, for example. As we've seen the growth in market demand for electric vehicles and for batteries, there is, of course, an increased demand for lithium. In the short run, that caused a significant price spike in lithium. But interestingly, over the last few months, we've now seen lithium prices start to pull back down. And the reason is we're bringing more lithium production to the marketplace. Lithium is a good example where there are actually abundant supplies of lithium. We just need to build out the mining infrastructure to be able to take it and refine it. Similarly, even rare earth metals, despite their name, are more abundant than maybe you would otherwise assume. The problem is, for example, in the US, we just haven't built out an industry to mine rare earth metals. It's largely China who's been doing that. So I'm optimistic that we're going to see the build out of these upstream industries to support the demand we're seeing for batteries and for solar panels and the like. What it does suggest is that in the short run, there's going to be some noise and there's going to be some friction here as we move it out. I don't think they're significant enough to kill these industries by any means, but you're going to see some of these kind of supply shocks happening as we move forward with this environment, this technology transition. The big thing with climate change is timing is everything. And I think this is where, again, policy can come in to really try to help move this stuff along quicker than it would, perhaps naturally. The Inflation Reduction Act has a lot in there to try to encourage, especially Western manufacturing of some of those core things that you were mentioning, Chris.
Thank you. All right, anybody else? All right, well, I'll keep going then. So when people talk about, clean energy, they always talk about wind and solar. Why doesn't anybody talk about nuclear?
Yeah.
As seriously? And just a little on story. A few months ago, I was listening to a speech from the CEO of the Port of Virginia, and part of their strategy as a carbon-free future is nuclear. And I called him on that. I asked a question about it because I was like, there's a lot of debate about if that's actually green or not. And he was like, it's carbon neutral or it's carbon net zero. And I was like, okay, fine. So what is your take on?
Yeah, I actually kind of agree with that perspective. Like I have no I have some environmental objections to nuclear, but in terms of climate change, I think that perspective is correct. That I think a lot of people feel like that nuclear needs to be part of our solution. It provides very inexpensive base load for powering our electrical needs. Here are the facts. In the United States, there's currently one new nuclear plant being built down in Georgia. It has taken decades to get to where it is today. It has cost billions and billions of dollars. If we look globally, countries that were leaders in nuclear, France, Japan, have all pulled back from their nuclear work and are actually decommissioning plants. You can obviously understand why in Japan that they're doing so after the earthquake and the tsunami. And so, again, while I don't have any philosophical argument against nuclear, and there's always a lot of rhetoric about we should be doing more nuclear, the fact is it doesn't seem to be market viable right now. The utilities and others are not pursuing it. There is one interesting exception to that, though, that I think is worth paying attention to, which is modular nuclear. So you think about, for decades, we've been producing nuclear reactors for submarines and the like. And so there's some really interesting progress being made on using nuclear reactors, small nuclear reactors, for like an individual data center or for an industrial plant. And apparently they're getting the cost down on that's becoming a more attractive proposition. So I think modular nuclear, I think there's some real possibilities there. I think in terms of large scale utility nuclear, I mean, ultimately it's going to require, I think, changes in policy that are going to be hard to get a lot of public sentiment, towards, because part of the reason it's so expensive is that it has to go through so many regulatory hurdles. You have all these NIMBY problems, and that's not necessarily a bad thing in the nuclear case.
All right, looks like we got a question from the chat.
Yes.
So I guess I'll just read it out loud from Alexander Helms. What are our options as architects to work with our local city planners to change zoning laws and increase financial incentives to drive these changes?
I think partly it's the pitch, right? And I think so often and correctly, like this is a critical issue we are facing as a global community with climate change. And so addressing that is important. However, I think there are often additional stories that can be told that make it a lot more palpable to political leaders. Too often, these types of technologies are framed as they're more expensive, they're going to hurt economic development, builders aren't going to like it because it's going to make building more expensive. There's obviously some truth to those types of sentiments. I don't want to be Pollyanna here. At the same time, there are some really compelling arguments, put the environment aside, of why you'd want to decarbonize. And it goes directly to some of the things I was talking about there. One would be resilience. Another would be in terms of kind of actually creating market opportunities for a commercial building by having this kind of integrated system where you can both produce and consume electricity and balance loads. Those are all arguably, economically and efficiency oriented, and can be part of the argument for why you should do this beyond just the environmental benefits. I'll give you one quick anecdote. I'm very proud to say at the Darden School, we've been net zero now for roughly 4 years. We did this by forming a power purchase agreement with Dominion Power for the Holyfield solar plant, a new solar arrangement that they brought online. One of the ways that we were able to sell that internally was that we looked at a forecasting model of natural gas prices versus the kind of locked in rate we'll be paying with the PPA for solar. And it was fairly easy to make a compelling argument that our downside risk if natural gas prices collapsed was actually pretty inconsequential to us. And the kind of the other risk of, let's call it the upside risk, would be if natural gas prices spiked, we would actually be paying far more in electricity than we're paying now in our PPA. And lo and behold, we're actually in that world right now. We are saving money by having a PPA on solar. A lot of the tech companies who have adopted heavy uses of solar and wind to power their data farms, partly driven by their environmental goals, partly driven though by resiliency and economic certainty, giving them, a very clean, understandable, predictable, and actually cheap source of energy. I think, again, those are the arguments I would make to local officials, that this is about getting that resiliency and efficiency out into the community, as well as the environmental benefits.
All right, we got another question in the chat. How can we balance the goals of decarbonization and resilience in building design and construction to ensure that structures are not only environmentally sustainable, but also able to withstand the impacts of climate change?
Yeah, this is a great question. As you can tell from my talk, I've definitely focused more on the mitigation side than the adaptation side. But at the same point, I think you're absolutely right that we're going to increasingly have to think about adaptation as we go through our built environment. Obviously, that's going to vary greatly depending on geography. The risks associated with climate change obviously just simply vary greatly between different regions. You see what's happening in California right now, the threat of significant actually runoff now, leading to significant flooding in the wake, and still perhaps being in drought even after all this is over. Those are a different set of challenges than we have here in Central Virginia. Very different set of challenges if you are in a coastal community and subject to hurricanes and the like there. So I do think adaptation is going to have to be a part of this as well. What I worry about is some of the rhetoric that suggests mitigation is hopeless. We just got to start adapting now, and let's not worry about curbing greenhouse gas emissions. Again, I think there's incredible uncertainty in the science of climate change. At the same time, a world with 3-4 degrees Celsius raise, I think could be devastating. And so, unfortunately, we got to do both. We've got to be both mitigating and adapting simultaneously.
So in the beginning of the presentation, you were talking about market disrupting technologies. So outside of, EV batteries becoming cheaper, what market disrupting technologies are you most excited for in the future?
Yeah, I think if I go through the list again, EVs and batteries, I think are well along the disruptive path line. I think solar and renewables with wind are on the same trajectory, though again, there's some additional challenges with intermittency and the like. I think there's a lot of interesting work happening at the system level. If you look at a lot of venture capital that's flown into this industry, a lot of it is around information technology, Internet of Things, smart grid. All of these are ways of creating some of the efficiencies as we move to this electrified world. I didn't talk about agriculture. Like I said, I think it's a particularly hairy problem, but you are seeing a huge investment in what we are calling ag tech now. This could be using precision GPS and data to be able to micro dose kind of fertilizer and water, create efficiencies, less environmental impact, more yield. That's exciting to me. Autonomy is another mega trend out there that could have significant impacts. If you think about automobiles, autonomy is obviously not as quick as what we're seeing with electrification, but will probably come, maybe the decade after. That just completely changes our consumption model for automobiles and transportation in ways that could actually create even further efficiencies and reduce electrical demand and the like. So, especially, like I said, in the digital world, which is kind of my other passion and interest, there's a lot of interesting things happening that could cause these systemic and drive changes here.
Cool. All right. I think we have time for one more question. If anyone in the chat wants to ask something or just speak out loud.
Well, maybe, Chris, I'll just end, by saying here that I always joke with my wife that I've always aspired to be an architect. She says I already have too much education, so I'm stuck just being a college professor. But I really do believe that the architecture field has obviously, for decades, been on the leading edge of sustainability and environmental resilience and the like. And I think continuing to push that envelope, not only in terms of like grandiose designs of how we can be more sustainable, but actually in terms of these transitions that I'm talking about. How do we get our existing infrastructure to switch over from fossil fuels to electrification? How can we think about net negative buildings and putting solar panels on roofs and the like? It is an incredible need and opportunity, but one that I think, as architects are there for the taking. And the exciting things from a market standpoint is it's becoming more and more market viable. This isn't a trade-off that you have to make. You can deliver exciting designs, exciting costs with some of these environmental impacts. And I think that trend will only continue moving forward here.
Yeah, I agree. All right, well, Michael, thank you for joining us today as part of AIA Virginia's 2023 Resiliency Week. That was a great speech. I hope everybody enjoyed it. And if you did enjoy it, you should join in Friday for Master Planning for Resiliency with Paula Loomis. So once again, thank you everybody for joining, and have a great rest of the week.